At the end of Paddington 2, the titular bear walks down the entrance corridor of his home and opens the front door to find his Aunt Lucy standing at the threshold. They embrace, and Aunt Lucy, moved to tears, quietly speaks the young cub's name, and Paddington tells her happy birthday as the movie fades to black. This made me cry. It made a lot of people cry. This single, simple moment was deeply powerful for just about all who witnessed it. And it's moments like that that have made the Paul King-directed Paddington movies so beloved. Based on these similarly beloved children's stories by Michael Bond about a marmalade-loving bear from darkest Peru, these were very simple tales of kindness and altruism, perfect representatives of the modern age of wholesome cinema. And I imagine if you haven't seen them, that description may very well not do a whole lot for you. I can say for myself that before I watched them, I figured the love for them was at least slightly ironic, perhaps a widespread in-joke among self-declared cinephiles that slowly but surely became more sincere due to constant exposure. But I've never been proven more wrong in my life, and I've never been more grateful for it. And I believe the thing that makes moments like this work, that makes the Paddington movies work more broadly, is that they aren't just wholesome movies about being nice. These are movies built on tension. And tension, I believe, is the thing that makes great art. The way that a writer or painter or musician can take the dissonance between things and create something beautiful, find the truths of the human experience within the interplay of the seemingly incompatible, divine a sense of beautiful order from this angry, terrifying, contradictory chaos that we call existence. And I think Paddington does that. In every aspect, every matter of filmic craft, writing, genre, and even theme, these are movies that play on tension to achieve their goals. Moments of anticipation and ideas rubbing up against each other that create this strange, remote sense of discomfort in the midst of these stories about an adorable CGI bear. And that enables the films to create both a fun, wholesome adventure at the same time as they speak rather authentically to basic human experiences. And I want to examine that use of tension to understand why exactly Paddington works, why moments like these possess such a unique kind of emotional potency. And that tension is most plainly seen in the way that the films handle their comedy. These are exceptionally funny movies, surprisingly so. I was shocked at how much I was laughing within the first 5 minutes of the first movie. Not blow air out your nose laughter, but actual out loud guffaws. And they're not funny in the way I think that many children's movies try to be funny. The humor of children's media tends to be split into two categories: the humor for the adults and the humor for the kids. The humor for adults in general tends to be based on the so-called adult jokes that can be found within it. Jokes with content that is not usually considered suitable for kids and that will probably go over their head. This humor is often not even derived from the joke itself, but from the irony of its inclusion in an ostensibly kid-friendly creation. A wink towards the adults in the theater from the adults in the editing bay that says, "Hey, here's one for you." Meanwhile, the humor intended for the children to laugh at is often either effortless toilet humor or effortless slapstick. A shoulder shrug from the adults in the editing bay that claims they're just kids, so we don't really have to try. They'll laugh at anything. And yeah, they probably will, but that doesn't mean they don't deserve something with more effort, and that is what the Paddington movies try to give them. Paddington's humor is much more skillful, working with a clear understanding that humor, when stripped down to its barest essentials, is just setups and payoffs, or more specifically, an establishment and release of tension. Take, for example, one of my personal favorite comedic set pieces in either movie. In Paddington 2, the titular bear tries to earn some money to buy his Aunt Lucy a birthday present by cleaning windows on his street. He fills up his bucket with soap and water, tries to pick it up, and realizes it's too heavy. He thinks for a moment, sees a pipe up above him, and gets an idea. He ties a rope to the bucket and then wraps the rope around the pipe at the top of the ladder to try and pull it up, only to realize that the bucket is still too heavy. Then he sees a potted plant on the windowsill and picks it up, that little bit of extra weight being just enough to pull the bucket up. However, once he gets down, he puts the plant on the ground and is suddenly pulled back up because physics. The bucket slams down onto the ground, sloshing water out of it, losing just enough weight for Paddington to fall back down, landing in the pot, letting go of the rope, and sitting down. He looks up, and the bucket falls directly on his head. I laughed my ass off at this. It's just so simple, taking a few props in a basic situation and turning it into a shockingly hilarious bit of slapstick comedy. The setup, or the establishment of tension, is Paddington's inability to pick up the bucket and his realization of the pipe up above, and it quietly builds that tension over each successive decision from there until we get to the final payoff, otherwise known as sweet release. A series of simple setups and simple payoffs, a few props, play with basic physics, build the tension, release it, repeat. It's so elegant in its simplicity, so thoughtful in every little decision, maintaining that tension through a light bit of dramatic irony as Paddington does things not realizing what's going to happen, while the audience likely does. My favorite bit is that final shot where the bucket drops, because you know it's coming. You saw Paddington let go of the rope, but the shot lingers for just long enough to keep the tension taut, making that release all the more effective. And that sense of tension in these smaller set pieces transfers over to the bigger ones as well. Take this scene in the first Paddington movie, where after Paddington has been taken in by his eventual adoptive family, the Browns, he goes to the bathroom to freshen up, not really knowing what that means. And I'm not going to go over this piece by piece like the last one because there's a lot more moving pieces, but what I want to illustrate is how a scene that starts with this and ends with this is pretty much the same thing as this. Ow. It's ultimately the same kind of setups and payoffs, but for much longer and with a few more pieces. Toothbrushes to earwax to mouthwash to toilet, each payoff another setup to escalate the tension further, maintaining its integrity through dramatic irony, both in the same way as in the bucket scene, and in how the film cuts intermittently to the rest of the family, completely unaware of what's happening. All of this building and building and building until we finally get to that wonderful release. The humor of Paddington 1 and 2 is pretty much just that. Setups, payoffs, tension, release. From small jokes like Paddington biting into a plastic tomato and earnestly saying, "That's not right," to bigger set pieces like the bucket scene, to even bigger set pieces like the bathroom scene. But it's not just how the slapstick is structured, because the character of Paddington himself also functions to enable this tension. Paddington is charming, adorable, and clumsy. He often doesn't think things through, he often misinterprets things, and he's adept at getting into the kind of trouble you'd think impossible if you didn't see it for yourself. And that actually makes Paddington the perfect kind of character for this style of humor. He is a character of constant tension because you know something is going to go wrong or be misinterpreted everywhere he goes. Every scenario Paddington is placed in already has a pre-established tension, and that makes it to where even outside the comedic set pieces, Paddington can be effortlessly funny. Every little thing he does can be a release, like seeing a stand on the right sign on the escalator and assuming that means he needs to stand on his right foot. This joke only really works if the character seeing that sign is already established as one who's likely to misinterpret it, so that seeing that sign becomes an immediate establishment of tension. And blunders like this are only made funnier by his gentle and polite demeanor itself in tension with these comical mishaps. It ensures that the humor is never derived from Paddington's humiliation, but always from the absurdity of the mishaps and misinterpretations themselves, because Paddington is too pure to be self-conscious. He can't be humiliated. But let's take a step outside of the film's humor, because this dedication to setup and payoff is also found in the very fabric of the film's scripts, particularly in Paddington 2. Paddington 2 is so dedicated to setup and payoff, in fact, I literally gasped at some of the payoffs because I didn't even realize they were set up. I've never gasped at a garbage collector showing up before, but I did when he showed up in Paddington 2. Almost every part of this opening scene alone is a setup for something later. Judy mentions the steam fair, they go to the steam fair later. Paddington gets a sarcastic response from the Colonel. Paddington helps brighten up his life by washing his windows, and then the Colonel is the one responsible for Aunt Lucy showing up at the end of the movie, but we're not there yet. Paddington talks to to the garbage collector, we already covered that. He interacts with this dog, he uses it to chase down a thief later on. Hell, the entire sequence is a setup in and of itself to show how Paddington makes his street and the city of London better, so that it can be shown later how his absence makes everything worse. But one of my favorites is Mrs. Bird finding a coin in Paddington's ear, and we'll get to the payoff for that later. Consider that a setup of my own. And all of this is just tension. Even if we don't notice it, our movie watching brains have learned that if something is established early on, it's likely going to matter later. We see that garbage collector, and in the back of our minds, we know we're probably going to see him again at some point or another. And in between the setup and payoff is the tension, the anticipation, the waiting that we don't even realize we're doing, holding in that state between what is happening at any given time and the faraway sense of anticipation we aren't even recognizing. And like with the humor, this style of narrative structure is aided considerably by the nature of Paddington's character, because so many of these releases are built on the back of Paddington's choices. The lack of self-consciousness in Paddington's character not only enables tension for the film's humor, but also for their plots, mostly because of how it enables one of Paddington's core traits: Paddington is kind. Paddington doesn't tend to worry too much about how other people perceive him, and that, combined with a general belief in good manners, leads him to an admirably selfless personality. And that selfless personality is what drives the plots of these films, because it makes him an active character. Things are rarely just happening to him, no, things happen as a consequence of his kind choices and how they interact, often in tension with the choices of others. You take Paddington out of the equation and these movies simply don't happen. None of these payoffs ever even get set up. Particularly in Paddington 2, many of the film's setups are acts of kindness by Paddington himself, willfully sharing the location of the pop-up book to Phoenix Buchanan, washing the Colonel's windows for free, trying to stop the thief who broke into the antique store. Hell, the entire plot is based on Paddington's desire to get the perfect gift for his Aunt Lucy's 100th birthday. Paddington's kind acts are the basis for much of the plot's forward momentum at any given time. And even in the first Paddington, where his kindness isn't affecting the plot quite as directly, it is still influencing the actions of other characters and the decisions they make that do affect the plot directly. Like how Henry only helps Paddington get into the Geographer's Guild after Paddington is shown to be having a positive impact on the lives of his children. Through both the humor and the plotting, Paddington utilizes tension to incredible effect to create satisfying and thoroughly entertaining narratives, both helped along by their strongly characterized active protagonist. But that's just how Paddington works as good, family-friendly entertainment. It's a good foundation, but it doesn't quite explain the enduring impact that these movies have had on the people who watch them. To understand that, we have to understand what exactly the Paddington movies are. And the Paddington movies are an example of a style of storytelling in which tension is implicit to its very core. Magical realism is kind of hard to define. Literary critic Luis Leo once said that if you can explain it, then it's not magical realism. But the basic idea is that it's a style of fiction where fantastical elements are not only present, but also usually unquestioned within an otherwise realistic world, like a talking bear in the modern day city of London, for instance. Now, that's a very basic and kind of limiting definition, and honestly, it's really better understood as just a you know it when you see it kind of thing. It's more of a feeling than a strictly defined idea. There are plenty of stories that don't strictly fall under that definition, but do feel like magical realism. I think Mamoru Hosoda's Wolf Children feels like magical realism, even though the magical elements aren't an unquestioned aspect of the film's world. Really, I think it's better defined by tension. The tension we feel as an audience seeing fantastical elements rendered as a part of our world without a proper explanation for how they got there. The tension between the familiar that needs no explanation and the unfamiliar that refuses to explain itself. And that's Paddington. Why is no one freaking out that there is a bipedal teddy bear with a hat talking directly to them on a train platform? How is a painting of a tree on a wall moving like that? What the fuck is up with this toy house? How did they get in there? Some of these, like the toy house house are probably better understood as just artistic license, using the visual medium to express things outside of reality that aren't meant to be taken strictly literally. But at the same time, Paddington looks directly at this miniature child, so it's hard to prove that he's not actually seeing it. And that uncertainty is kind of a part of the magical realist experience. It's a part of that tension, that purposeful strain on your willing suspension of disbelief. If this is a world where a talking bear goes unquestioned, then who's to say these other magical elements aren't also meant to literally be there? There's a freedom of expression found within that tension, the ability to convey things in a way that you couldn't in something strictly realist, while also not having to delve into complete abstraction in order to express a more complicated idea, like when Paddington melts into the screen showing his old home, overcome by nostalgia and this sense of longing for a time and a place now unavailable to him. Through magical realism, these films are able to explore more complicated experiences without ever betraying their simplicity of form. Paddington literally moving through the pop-up book with Aunt Lucy is not only visually very impressive, but also an incredible way of expressing Paddington's love for his Aunt Lucy, the recognition of what this gift would mean to her, and his desire to see her in person again, walk with her, talk with her, give her a hug. The way that this present in and of itself aids him to connect with one of the most important people in his life, even if it is ultimately insufficient to his true desires. This is such a wonderful way to express that emotional state without ever saying it out loud. This pop-up book becomes itself a magical means by which to literally do something that would otherwise remain abstract, giving life to an idea by playing on the tension between the reality of our surroundings and the reality of our emotional experience. And it's because of that strange relationship to reality that Paddington is able to engage with that reality in a kind of interesting way. Paddington simplifies the reality it presents to its audience, just as all narrative art must do. All stories depict, in some sense or another, an idealized form of reality, in so much as the story can happen exactly how the writer needs it to happen to create the experience they're trying to create. It's a concession that every writer must make. Reality is messy and contradictory in a way that fiction just can't be if it's going to function, even if the writer is good enough to make it not seem that way. Children's stories like Paddington simply do it to the greatest extent allowable, as they try to make sure that their intended audience is able to understand the experience through simpler plots with fewer complications to get in the way of the main point. The struggle in this is making sure that simplification doesn't skew into inadvertent deception, finding the balance between crafting a coherent emotional experience for your target audience and making sure that experience is reflective enough of reality to be resonant. And it's through magical realism that Paddington gracefully walks that line, because magical realism allows for more complex realities to be explored in all their nuance without having to engage with them directly. These realities can instead be represented in fewer dimensions through symbolism and metaphor, while keeping it clear what is actually being talked about. It's a kind of subtext that is just barely subtext, just over the line to where it doesn't have to deal with all the complications of what it's discussing, while also being able to speak to the core truth at the heart of it. For example, the first Paddington is about immigration, and the only people who wouldn't see that immediately are literal children because it's only barely subtextual. Paddington is a foreigner from Peru who goes to a country with a culture he has no direct experience of, looking for a home after a natural disaster forces him to leave the home he grew up in. There are many people who don't trust him out of fear and insecurity, and there's one person in particular looking to take advantage of those fears and insecurities in order to pursue their own personal goals and enrichment. This is not me explaining a metaphor, this is just what happens in the movie. The only thing preventing it from being a story about real-life immigration is that the immigrant at the heart of the movie is a talking teddy bear with no specific analogs in real life. Thus, the film is able to acknowledge the reality outside of its own fiction, but stops short of actually being realistic, exploring real-life social issues in a way where it doesn't have to deal with any real-life considerations, while still being able to tell a coherent story about the inherent worth of knowing how to treat a stranger. And therein lies the tension, the true most powerful tension at the heart of Paddington. There's tension in the technical elements of its humor and narrative. There is tension in the very genre that it exists within. But the truest tension, the thing that defines Paul King's Paddington movies for me, is the tension between the magical, simplified reality they take place in and the real world that these movies were made in. A tension that takes form within the framework of the films themselves as the tension between Paddington's ideals of kindness and compassion and the world around him that is constantly failing those ideals. And the best way to truly explore that tension is in the plot of Paddington 2. Paddington 2 is a movie in every aspect about trust, about living authentically and believing that everyone else is probably doing the same. It's built on Paddington's own deeply trusting nature, trusting to the point of gullibility. When Mrs. Bird finds that coin in his ear, he actually believes that she found it in his ear. And that's a harmless little magic trick, but it does go to show that Paddington trusts people implicitly. And of course, the only way that you can trust people implicitly is if you live in an idealized world where everybody tells the truth all the time. But what if a person exists in your world who is unable to do that? Phoenix Buchanan is an actor, having played many roles throughout his life. He is also a character that is constantly putting on a performance in his everyday life, constantly wearing costumes, constantly acting like someone he's not, constantly lying to the people around him. But what's more interesting to me about Phoenix Buchanan is not that he's a liar, it's that it's hard to imagine him being anything else. Twice, Phoenix is shown in his attic lair surrounded by his past costumes, his past performances, both treating them as external identities at the same time as he is taking on those identities, split multiple ways into all of the different characters he has existed as throughout his life. And as such, I don't think that Phoenix Buchanan really even knows who he is. He's vain and wants everybody to pay attention to him, but in a very specific kind of way, consistently calling attention only to his past successes. His entire goal in the movie is to find the treasure that this pop-up book I talked about earlier holds clues to and use that wealth to fund a one-man show that is just an amalgamation of his past roles. He has completely and utterly defined himself as the roles he once played that people loved him for, and gives no indication that he understands himself beyond those roles on any level, always wanting to be perceived but never truly known. In a way, he's the inverse of Paddington, not only completely uncaring of how he affects other people, but also deeply self-conscious, having built his entire identity on what people see when they look at him. And how can somebody be authentic when the very nature of their authentic self has been lost to them? How can you trust someone who doesn't even know what the truth is? And that is the tension of Paddington 2. This character who trusts everyone implicitly, who believes that people are worth trusting, being confronted with the notion of untrustworthy people. And the primary character the movie explores that tension through isn't Phoenix Buchanan, it's actually this guy.
It's Knuckles, with a capital N.
After being framed for the theft of the pop-up book by Phoenix Buchanan, Phoenix giving critical false testimony that sealed his fate, Paddington is sent to prison and meets the prison chef, a man by the name of Knuckles McGinty. Paddington accidentally put a lone red sock into a batch of black and white prison laundry, causing all of the prisoners' clothes to go pink. One of the prisoners says they'll let it go if Paddington can get Knuckles to change the menu to anything but weird white slop, a proposition that Paddington responds to with,
Aunt Lucy said, if you look for the good in people, you'll find it.
Paddington is his characteristic, very honest self, and Knuckles is introduced to his particular brand of polite chaos. He does not take well to this. Knuckles threatens to beat him until Paddington shoves a marmalade sandwich into his mouth, the glorious taste of this wonderful treat stopping him in his tracks and moving him to hire Paddington on to help him in the kitchen, or rather to sit and let Paddington do all the work. But it only takes Paddington's tendency to take things very literally and a good hard stare whenever Knuckles insults Aunt Lucy to get him to help. And from there, it only takes one minor exchange to change everything.
These aren't exactly made for cooking.
Looks to me like you've got yourself a fine pair of orange squeezers.
I love this exchange for two reasons. One, as I stated, it is the impetus to everything changing. Knuckles helps Paddington make the marmalade sandwiches. That leads to other prisoners sharing their recipes. That leads to the prison mess hall becoming an out-and-out restaurant, which leads to an entire overhaul of the prison culture. Planters on the railings, bedtime stories at night, and choreographed dance sequences are now all a part of the experience. And it started here. Or really, it started with that little bit of chaos Paddington injected into this place of strict order by way of a red sock. But this was the point that change solidified. And two, it helps to answer that question we posed a little earlier. How can you trust someone who doesn't even know what the truth is? And the answer is that you tell them the truth. Knuckles is a character who has an identity imposed on him to some extent. He's the big bad man who will literally kill you if you criticize his cooking. When he looks at his beefy arms, he sees nothing but tools for violence because that's what everybody else sees.
My father always said I'd amount to nothing, and he was right.
Knuckles, much like Phoenix Buchanan, doesn't really know himself outside of what people perceive him as. And in that state, all it really takes is to just offer another perception. Those arms aren't just murder weapons, they're orange squeezers. Your ability to use a knife like that can be used for making marmalade and not whatever horrifying thing you used to use it for. Knuckles is not a very trustworthy or trusting person. He's implied to have done some very bad things, but simply treating him and the others like they are more than just prisoners, refusing to define them solely by the bad things they've done, trusting that they can be trusted, opens up a whole new world of possibilities for who they can be and what they can do. But that's not where it ends. That doesn't quite resolve the tension, because while Paddington's trusting nature has been very helpful to him up to now, there are two things that happen in quick succession that force him to question just how valuable that trusting nature is. The first is that the prisoners, taught by the world that nobody can be trusted for long, plant the idea in his head that the Browns will eventually forget about him. Not out of any kind of malice, but because they've experienced it themselves. Paddington doesn't believe them because he trusts the Browns. He trusts that they're still hot on the trail of the real thief and are going to come and tell him everything they've learned, but they don't. They were so busy doing that, in fact, they missed visiting hours at the prison. But Paddington, having had that seed planted in his mind, starts for the first time to doubt. He imagines himself back in Peru, back with his Aunt Lucy, back home where everything was perfect, the green lush of the jungle, the warmth of a hug that only a bear can give, but it all falls away to the cold reality that he's still in prison. However much he spruces things up, however many planters he puts on the railings, however much good food he's introduced, it's still prison, and he believes the Browns have forgotten him. It is perhaps the most literal representation of that tension I've been talking about, that idealized fantasy melting away into terrible reality, the ideal failing to hold up in the midst of that tension, the real world pulling it apart at the seams, aided by Paddington's perceptions created by the perceptions of others. And so he decides to break out with the others, putting his trust in them. They've told him that they're going to not only get out, they're going to help clear his name. If the Browns have forgotten him, at least he has them. At least he has Knuckles. But once they succeed, they take him to a plane to leave the country.
I want to clear my name and go home. And you said you'd help. You promised.
Sorry, kid. No can do.
Forgotten and betrayed. He believed that people were worth trusting, and yet at every turn, all people have done is lie to him and about him, both deliberately and incidentally. But the difference doesn't matter right now. Right now, it just feels like everybody around him is showing him that he was wrong, that Aunt Lucy was wrong. That ideal world where everybody tells the truth all the time, it just isn't this one. It never was. Paddington runs away, and Knuckles just says,
That's his choice.
Walking alone on the streets of London in the dead of night, Paddington finds a phone booth sitting neglected in an alleyway, and with the coin Mrs. Bird found in his ear at the beginning of the movie, he calls his family. I view it as one last act of trust to believe that they'll be there for him in his time of need, but all he gets is voicemail. His excited tone turning dour as he realizes and explains what happened apologetically, trying to say goodbye before he runs out of time. And he's left alone in a dark alley on a cold, silent night. I think a lot about the lessons we were taught as kids. Be nice to each other. Don't push other people down. Share what you have with others. And it sometimes feels like, as we grow older, those lessons are being beaten out of us. As we grow older and engage further with a world becoming more and more complex, as we grow more conscious of it, so too come those who want to convince us that those lessons aren't worth much. They aren't realistic. They're too naive for this complex world of ours, too simple for a world where everybody lies and everyone fails to be the best version of themselves. They try to teach us new lessons. Only look out for yourself. Fear the unfamiliar. Always be on guard. Stay in your home. Close the blinds, only peek out to make sure nobody's standing outside with a gun. And then these new lessons form the basis for other lessons. The immigrants are coming to steal your jobs and your homes with their weird languages and strange cultures. These criminals are out to get you specifically. They like hurting people. It's just in their nature, just who they are. So push them back, keep them at a distance, send them back where they came from, lock them up in cold, dreary cells and force them to eat slop. It's what they deserve. It's the only way to keep you safe. At the end of the day, it really comes down to two simple truths. The world is cruel, and we have no choice but to be cruel in response. This is a video about Paddington, a talking bear whose primary traits include liking marmalade and being nice. But that's what I see when I watch these movies. I see a world that is afraid, insecure, driven to hatred and cruelty by way of that fear and insecurity. I see a world that so often fails Paddington Brown. But I also think that's exactly why these movies work, because they don't ignore that tension. They don't act like it's not there and just get lost in the idealized fantasy of their filmic reality. They don't feel overly naive because they're not. These movies are not about how the world and everyone in it is good. They know that all too often it isn't, and they aren't. They acknowledge from all angles that people can make the wrong choices, look at things the wrong way, lie, betray your trust, be bad people. They admit the fallibility of human beings and the pitfalls of Paddington's worldview. No, they're not about how the world and everyone in it is good. What they're about is how the world and everyone in it can be good. That no one is a lost cause, that the world has joy and love to give in spades. They teach children that lesson for the first time, but for adults like myself, most likely like you, they bring us back to that period when we were children, that period of setup, when everything was still possible and anyone could be anything. And I think they show us that as our perception of the world becomes more complex, we tend to let those newer lessons dominate our thinking, and we tend to look at things only in one direction. That the world must be worse than we once assumed, that everything is darker than we once believed it to be. That's certainly easier. At least then we don't have to try, because it's pointless to try. We don't want to try because we're afraid we can't withstand the tension that comes from acknowledging that it's worth trying. Acknowledging that in the other direction, just as our capacity to perceive the bad became greater, so too did our capacity to perceive the good, the love that continues to exist in spades right alongside all the bad. And the tension between these things can be overwhelming. It is impossible to hold for too long on our own. That burden is too great sometimes. We entered that tension long ago. That question of when the bucket's gonna drop and what's gonna happen when it does. I think these movies know that. I think they know that all too well for children's movies about a clumsy bear. And I think what they are is a series of releases, a series of moments where we can not only laugh, but cry, remember, feel. Moments of magic, of joy, of endurance and calm, a release of tension in a kind woman coming back after passing you by, in making marmalade with your found family, in being told that part of yourself you always believed was one thing could actually be another, in a neglected phone booth in a dark London alleyway that you thought would remain silent, suddenly ringing. The Browns call back, telling Paddington that they'd never forget him, explaining to him about everything they've learned about Phoenix Buchanan, and it all leads to this big, wonderful climax where everyone gets a chance to accept themselves for who they are, and in Paddington's greatest moment of need, who shows up but the prisoners? Knuckles. The same man who said he don't do nothing for nobody for nothing, but he's here, saving this bear who changed his life by telling him he had a fine pair of orange squeezers. They're here because in a world where everyone treated them like they were nothing more than prisoners, Paddington believed they were people. Just like how Paddington believed that the Browns would pick up that call, just like how he believed that someone in London would give him a home, and by believing those things, he helped make them true. Paddington is a character of tension. Sure, that means he's particularly suited to misunderstanding things, misinterpreting signs and cues to comedic effect, but I think it means something else too. He's a character whose radical kindness and optimism serves as a point of natural tension with the world around him. The result is often chaos, disorder, a tub falling down the stairs, and pink prison uniforms. But it's only in that chaos, only in engaging with that present tension, that we find those moments of release. And it's in those releases that we find the truth, the authentic, and the real. I think Paddington works because it goes through that tension with us, holding our hands gently all the while and maintaining through it all that it's worth it for those moments of release that come if we act like they will. Paddington 2 begins with the titular bear trying to get this pop-up book of London, this imperfect facsimile of the city, this imperfect connection between Paddington and his Aunt Lucy. And in the midst of everything going on in the second act, that part of the story could easily be forgotten. By the end, Paddington is trying to get the pop-up book to clear his name and set everything right. Aunt Lucy's birthday kind of pales in comparison for obvious reasons. But it was through those small acts of kindness throughout the movie, that engagement with the tension, that enabled this moment of authenticity, this connection, this release. And when I watch it, when I watch that embrace, everything, all that tension suddenly feels like it's worth it. Hey, thanks for watching this video about Paddington. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did enjoy it, you can subscribe to the channel to see new videos when they come out. And if you want to support me in making more like this one, you can click the link in the description to join my Patreon. And for only $2 a month, get early access to videos along with exclusive companion videos. This time I talked about Paul King's Wonka and how its struggle against being a prequel creates an interesting narrative about the nature of nostalgia. That's only $2 a month for that video and more. Once again, thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope to see you next time.